Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
And I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Ariel Bogle, who is an investigations reporter with The Guardian Australia, focusing on extremism and technology. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Ariel, I hate to do this to you, but the last time you were on, we talked quite a bit about Catboy Cammy.
Oh, yes.
Are there any Catboy Cammy updates?
I do check in from time to time. He still posts from time to time, but is just nowhere near as prolific. He got very gym bro-y, very fitness influencer, but not too much to say at the moment about Catboy Cammy.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Probably for the best, right?
Indeed.
There has been quite a bit else going on. Recent revelations about Tenet Media and Russia. Could you maybe tell our listeners who aren't aware what Tenet Media is or was and what's going on with these sneaky Ruskies?
Yeah, this is a super interesting indictment unsealed last week in the United States. And it basically alleged that a Tennessee-based media company was secretly a Russian-backed influence operation. So, in fact, they didn't name the company itself in the indictment, but they gave enough details, enough sort of breadcrumbs for everyone to work it out pretty quickly. So it said the US company described itself as a, quote, network of heterodox commentators that focused on Western political and cultural issues, and identified about 6 commentators or influencers within that cohort. So it's basically been named as Tenet Media, which has now actually been shut down by YouTube. And people sort of got busy trying to unveil who these influencers might be. And some of them have now come out publicly and said they're victims of this scheme just as much as anyone else. And those are people like Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, Dave Rubin, and a bunch of others.
We were sort of joking about this before, but seriously, how do we get this Russian money, Ariel?
I know. So, the money is good. That is a really interesting part of the indictment. So it looks like these influencers got pretty healthy salaries. Dave Rubin apparently got about $400,000 a month to make around 16 videos.
Sorry, Ariel, $400,000 a month?
That's what the indictment suggests, and people have reported since. And according to the indictment, at least how the indictment matches up with the reality, it looks like Tim Pool might have been paid around $100,000 per video, which he produced weekly. So decent numbers out there.
Do you think they got bang for their buck?
This is a really interesting question because Tenet Media was not that big on the scene. So all these influencers, people like Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, they have YouTube channels with a really healthy audience. I think Rubin has more than 2 million subscribers, whereas the YouTube channels, they were only getting like a couple of thousands of views per video. And I actually took a look, although YouTube has now removed Tenet Media, it's still present on some of the more alternative video platforms like Rumble. And even there, they're only getting maybe like 5,000, 6,000 views. So there is definitely a question there about the bang for buck. But Will Sommer, now a reporter at the Washington Post, pointed out that perhaps the goal was not necessarily to make each individual video like complete winner, hundreds of thousands of views. Maybe the goal was to over time build Tenet Media itself as a platform and then as an influential platform. So perhaps there was sort of a long-term view going on here.
It sort of beggars belief that the victim claim that you could be getting paid this amount of money for this content that wasn't exactly popping off and not realise that there was something a little suspicious afoot.
Yeah, definitely. There's some weird stuff going on here. Some of the influencers appeared, according to the indictment, to at least ask the question about who was really behind it. And in fact, the founders gave the name of some odd European guy who had lived in Paris and had this whole persona. They provided like a picture and a CV, but of course this person didn't really exist. And in fact, the founders, it's interesting to note too, they have now been sort of outed as Canadian conservative YouTuber Lauren Chen and her husband Liam Donovan. They've not publicly commented on these allegations, to my knowledge, and they're certainly not indicted in this indictment either, we should note, but they're allegedly the founders here as well.
Ariel, do you think that this exposure will actually, what effect will it have on the careers of these influencers?
I mean, they really came out strongly saying that they were the victims here. Benny Johnson's statement was that his lawyers had negotiated a standard arm's length deal with Tenet Media, which was later terminated. He was disturbed by the allegations in the indictment and want to make it clear that myself and other influencers were victims. Dave Rubin had a similar kind of statement, and he also mentioned that the Department of Justice had never contacted him regarding this matter. So they're definitely trying to keep it at arm's length. And it is true that in the indictment, there's no mention that the founders, or indeed the kind of Russian founders, the ones who are actually indicted by the Department of Justice, were able to strongly influence the topics chosen. There's actually some funny anecdotes in the indictment. So around February 15, one of the Russian operatives shared a video of a well-known US political commentator visiting a grocery store in Russia. And this is actually Tucker Carlson on his visit to Russia, where he interviewed Putin and all the rest. And one of the producers at Tenet privately messaged one of the founders on Discord saying, they want me to post this, referencing that video, but it just feels like overt chilling, quote unquote. But the founder said, I think we should put it out there, and they acquiesced. All right, I'll put it out tomorrow. So there's some funny details there, but certainly like the content, there's no evidence in the indictment that it was like a complete A to B of messaging. But when you look through all the videos, it's some pretty typical conservative fare. Lauren Southern's got videos about how Canada is becoming a communist hellhole, the real truth about Project 25. It's pretty typical like YouTube conservative fare at this point.
And Lakemba's a no-go zone. Is that still the case in 2024?
We'll have to get Lauren to come back and ask that question again.
Well, if anyone from the FSB is listening, I will play the full album version of Moscow by Genghis Khan at the end of every show for a very reasonable fee.
That's definitely value for money. I should mention too that the people indicted here are employees of Russia Today, the Russian state-controlled media outlet, and they were pushed out of the United States when they were sanctioned following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So to put this in context too, this has the sort of veneer of RT trying to get its sort of claws back into the United States, trying to get a presence here with getting around those sanctions.
So what you're arguing, Ariel, is that this is really a case of free speech, right?
Well, if we wanted the philosophy debate, I'm interested to see if some of the influencers that were on the Tenet Media Network will sort of take up the flag for Tenet, but so far they've definitely tried to keep their distance, it seems, in the statements they've put out.
Ariel, you've also recently written about AI slop. Could you tell us about this story with the health influencer? And is it not right that we can cure our cancer with bicarb soda?
Please don't do that. That's definitely not health advice. Yeah, so it's really interesting. Barbara O'Neill is an Australian health influencer, and she has been banned actually from practicing medicine, giving health advice here in Australia. That happened in 2019 when she was found by the New South Wales Healthcare Complaints Commission to have given highly risky health advice to vulnerable people, including, as you mentioned, the use of bicarbonate soda as a cancer treatment. And she's just struck me as an interesting character because even though she was banned, I could just see that her presence online was going from strength to strength in many ways. So she still had a really active social media presence to an extent. People were posting a lot of her content. There's a lot of YouTube videos of her giving health advice, showing audiences different health practices that have been shared, in fact, by Seventh-day Adventist churches all over the world, because that's a church of which she is a member. So I started digging into seeing just how her message was continuing to spread, and I found this pretty rigorous touring schedule, very much linked to Seventh-day Adventist religious presences globally, this social media. But then I started to notice too, there was a lot of very odd content, especially on TikTok and on Facebook ads. And it seemed like she'd kind of got caught up in this new generative AI slop complex. And I'm not the first person to have come up with that term. I actually talked to Jason Kobler from 404 Media, and he's dug into this AI slop economy too, where people are using these new generative AI tools to create pretty eye-catching imagery and video and to try and use it to make money in all kinds of new ways. So he looked at how people were trying to get engagement on Facebook to earn Facebook kind of influencer commissions, essentially. And I looked at the way some of these generative AI imagery of Barbara O'Neill is being used to sell products, herbal teas, different kind of tinctures, different kind of minerals, all without her permission, I should note. But it's just a huge economy out there.
Ariel, who does this sort of content appeal to? Who's buying this stuff?
It's a great question. I mean, I think health is of interest to everybody. When you look at the audiences that go to Barbara O'Neill's in-person sessions, they really do vary in terms of demographics, age, gender, the rest. I mean, you have some kind of concepts of exactly who might be seeing these TikTok ads. On Facebook, I found some interesting ads, a lot around erectile dysfunction, actually, and prostate issues that combined an image, sort of deep fake of Barbara O'Neill, seemingly an interview with Tucker Carlson. So, I mean, I'm guessing in the mind of the scammer, perhaps this appeals to a guy that's into Tucker, but hard to say.
So, not teenagers?
You never know, but it didn't seem hugely teenage focused because it was a lot around health hacks. So some of this content showed images that appeared like Barbara O'Neill was being arrested for sharing forbidden health knowledge. And then you would scroll through on TikTok and it would link you out to a special kind of herbal tea or something like that. So who knows, perhaps not teenagers, but definitely capturing a lot of women and mums, I would say as well, judging by the comments.
And what sort of things have you been seeing in terms of AI slop when it comes to politics?
Yeah, there's some really interesting sort of people starting to talk about this. Charlie Walsall in The Atlantic had a piece about how the MAGA aesthetic is AI slop. And I kind of agree with that. When you see a lot of the generative AI imagery being shared, especially on X or Twitter, a lot of that, some of it generated by Twitter's own kind of generative AI tool, Grok, it has this kind of particular, kind of sickly veneer. It shows Trump cuddling kittens in this kind of really colourful but too smooth image of Trump, or really unflattering images of Kamala Harris, often extremely sexualized, which unfortunately seems par for the course for women in politics to be targeted in that way. But yeah, the suggestion, I guess, here is that kind of AI distinctive image style, which is kind of like a tabloid illustration, has now become the kind of de facto imagery of conservatism or republicanism in the United States.
And would you describe this sort of content as being a form of trolling? What do you think is apart from engaging an audience, do you think it has great impact?
I think a lot of this content is not wholly deceptive. I don't think a lot of people are seeing this image of Trump cuddling a kitten and being like, that's definitely for sure a real image. Sometimes it can get a little more photorealistic when it comes to the imagery of Kamala Harris that tries to show her in a hypersexualized light, or suggesting that there's bikini pics of her or something. That's where it sort of more seems to be more photorealistic. But in terms of this MAGA style that Charlie Walsall, for example, was talking about, that's more about eye-catching, overt, and sort of, definitely about shitposting and trolling, mocking and degrading images of Harris and other Democratic politicians, as he said.
A number of people have detected a certain shift in the content on X or Twitter since Elon Musk took over. Have you had an opportunity to, I guess, in your reportage, examine what's happened since he's taken control?
Perhaps a shift is an understatement, I would say. I find my own personal experience of X, I don't know what to say, highly degraded, perhaps is the best word for it. I used to find Twitter such a useful information source. I would discover sort of cliques of experts in different areas. I would get news. Now, on a really basic level, if I click one post, I suddenly see 6 just like it, which is definitely not what I'm after. But certainly, if we're going to talk about trolling content, racist content, anti-Semitic content, I just see so much more of it than I ever did. So clearly, the content moderation guardrails are completely off. And of course, Elon Musk himself is in the mix there, promoting a lot of this content himself.
Given this degeneration, is X sustainable, and how much longer do you think that Musk would be happy to continue to subsidise it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we hear these stories all the time about advertisers fleeing, Musk threatening to sue advertisers that leave the platform. Certainly, I mean, if I was the CEO of a brand with a reputation to protect, I might be a little nervous about having my loaf of bread next to a complete Holocaust denial tweet or something else. I guess the question there is whether it can work out a way to make money. I do doubt it's making enough money from verified accounts to sort of tick over there. But given it's giving Musk a lot of attention, perhaps he'll keep subsidizing it till the bitter end.
Given X has become less useful and polluted, let's say, do you think it's time for users to jump ship for the metaverse? And can you tell us anything about what has become of it? Because it seemed to have slipped out of the news.
Oh, Facebook's metaverse, yeah. I don't know if that's going to be a good replacement. I thought you were going to say a Blue Sky or a Thread, which do seem to be developing somewhat of an audience over there. Definitely not at the scale and speed as an old school Twitter, but there are people over there. Yeah, I don't know. When are you guys going to leave? I haven't got my line in the sand yet. I mean, it's pretty brutal. I probably should have left already, but curious when you guys are going to go.
Cam?
Well, if you look at my frequency of posting, then I think I've got one foot out the door already.
Fair enough.
I mean, I do ask about metaverse because I think about it in terms of, I suppose, not quite, but broadly belonging to the category of AI slop, in the sense that there's this seemingly accelerating technological process which is producing goods and services which are either not wanted or perhaps harmful. So I'm wondering if this is what's your take on the kind of broader trend within technology, what it's affording the public, and I guess also how it allows for extremist content?
I think you made a good point there. There's a distance here between what people want and what they're being kind of force-fed to an extent. I think the metaverse palaver of a few years ago indicated this very well, because Facebook shifted all this investment into the metaverse, a product for which there seemed to be very little organic demand, and they've really kind of stopped talking about it, at least in kind of their public PR pushes. And the same goes for a lot of this generative AI content, like the sort of Barbara O'Neill investigation I did and a lot of other reporting in this space. These tools create fairly easy to use, but the output is highly questionable, and the way they were created, of course, is highly questionable from a copyright standpoint, or at least the livelihoods of the people whose art or work was stolen, taken to train these tools. And it puts me in mind too of a piece I did earlier this year around deep fake, the non-consensual sexual material of people. So there's some open source generative AI platforms out there where you can essentially create your own AI model. And the company behind it talks this big talk around art, promoting the technology, promoting art, promoting advancement. But at the end of the day, there's essentially people putting up requests for certain models, certain actresses, 99% of the time women, to create models of them. So I talked to two Australian models and OnlyFans creators who essentially had a ton of their images taken to create one of these models so people could create whatever images of them that they wanted. And of course, this felt extremely violating because suddenly people could create images of themselves doing things, looking in certain ways like they would never have done themselves. And my question here is, why did this technology really need to exist at the end of the day? Like, what greater purpose did it serve? It was inevitably going to be used this way.
Ariel, Anthony Albanese has come up with an alternative solution to all of the problems of the internet, which is to ban children from it. I was wondering what you thought about the idea of a minimum age requirement for using social media, and should there perhaps be a maximum age requirement as well?
Great question. I have gotten in trouble in the past when I've talked about older people on social media, so I'm going to be careful what I say there. I'm sure there are very savvy older tech users. Sometimes it can be an issue, but certainly if there's going to be younger bans, there should be older bans in my view. Definitely this is a strange brainwave from the government. I think in many ways I'm not the first to point this out, but there's a whole privacy law agenda that they could be working their way through right now, but instead we're taking these kind of side quests. I mean, there's plenty of criticism out there that I can point to, but I think we need to be very careful about any tool that would gate, I suppose, some platforms and require people to hand over sensitive documentation, passports, other proof of identity to, again, these sort of random companies. Like, I'm certainly not going to give Twitter or X my passport image. That seems extremely foolish, and I wouldn't want to give Facebook the same either. So there's that concern. Then there's the concern alone around the importance of children and teenagers having some sort of access to the internet if it can be done in a safe and sort of supervised at times way. But I do think that the internet can be really important for people to find community, especially people that might live in kind of remote or regional areas. If they feel like their identity is not supported there, the internet can be a real lifeline. So there's plenty of problems here that they're going to just stir with this brainwave of a policy suggestion.
On a slightly different tone, Ariel, you've also reported on Serco's use of technology to help monitor and control essentially asylum seekers and refugees in Australia. Can you talk a little bit about that, and do you think we can expect those sorts of practices to become more widespread?
Certainly. Well, this Serco tool was called the Security Risk Assessment Tool, and I'd heard rumours of it over a couple of years, and I decided to sort of dig into it earlier this year. Essentially, it's a rating system that everybody who enters immigration detention in Australia is subject to, but in fact they're not told it exists, which is a very sort of bizarre scenario. But this rating takes into account things like your criminal background, say if you have one, and it gives you certain ratings for a propensity for actions such as self-harm, protest, and gives you an overall rating of likelihood of violence and risk of escape. And so, of course, this can have really severe consequences if the rating, it can have severe consequences full stop. But based on the experiences of people I talked to in my story, if that rating especially is based on incorrect information or unfair assumptions about the type of person, it can result in really severe situations. So I mentioned in the piece one example where somebody was wrongly rated as having a criminal history when they in fact didn't, and they were placed in a high security section of the detention centre where they were placed, where they were later assaulted. So it had that extreme sort of impact there. I think it was really disturbing too to sort of look at how these risk rating tools kind of escalate. Like, there's no motivation here for the tool to downrate somebody. It just goes up essentially. So some of the scenarios were somebody made an application, an immigration detainee made an application to participate in excursions outside the centre, but they were refused. So that person joined other detainees in a series of sit-down protests that were entirely peaceful. But after these activities, they then received a high risk rating for demonstration, which was one of the behavioural risk categories on the SRAT. And then they were also assessed as high risk for escort, which means they can no longer participate in excursions anyway. So it has that kind of extreme circular logic, which is so dangerous. I think the issue here too is just the extreme lack of transparency. As I mentioned, the detainees themselves are not told it exists, so they have very little opportunity to challenge their rating, to understand what their rating was based on. And really a lot of the information that's come out about this tool was people that were told it exists by a lawyer, and then they go through a sort of really extreme FOI process. And I did, of course, my own FOI, my own digging and reporting to get at this tool, which just the lack of transparency, as I said, the opaqueness of this tool, the kind of circular logic of it, it's just really a stark example of the way these algorithms can be weaponized.
To what extent is this an automatic process, and what's the kind of, are there systems of oversight that are meant to correct these so-called mistakes?
Well, my understanding is that everybody's SRAT assessment is meant to be revisited monthly. But talking to former employees of Serco and other people that have worked in immigration detention, it appears like it's very, very rare for a rating to go backwards. There's just so many ways it can be escalated and go up. So, for example, the more incidents you have in immigration detention, maybe you talked back to a guard, maybe you took something that somebody alleges it belonged to someone else or something. This is not a judicial system within Serco, but the guards act in that kind of capacity. So the guards get a lot of discretion as to how they fill out this SRAT system. So it seemed like that could really cause some escalations as well. So, for example, there was someone I called Noah in the piece who entered Villawood, for example, as a low placement risk. And the risk rating changed to high because the SRAT incorrectly stated their criminal history, and they were placed in a high security compound where they were assaulted by other detainees. And essentially, after they complained and realised that they had this SRAT and that had wrongly categorised them as a high risk, their risk rating was downgraded to medium, but that's a really rare example.
Serco itself has its fingers in many pies across the globe. Is there any evidence to suggest that these kinds of social control mechanisms are being rolled out elsewhere?
This is a really significant fear because I think, although these technologies broadly are often tested on the most vulnerable populations within our society, people in prison, people in immigration detention, people in welfare systems, that's just usually the beginning. That's where the technology is often tested, but we do often see it roll out more broadly. And of course, this is not to say it should be tested on those vulnerable populations in the first place. I should point out too that Serco didn't just come up with this tool on its own for no reason. It was actually asked to come up with a tool like this by Home Affairs. So I think this SRAT system really needs to be placed in that overall context of Australia's immigration policy and our policy of placing people in immigration detention centres. So, yeah, I suppose a risk rating system like this, a kind of algorithmically driven risk rating system, is very much a product of its context and the policy decisions that got it there.
Ariel, we've recently seen another indictment drop aimed at the alleged founders of something called Telegram. Can you explain to listeners what that is and what do you think is the significance of this new indictment?
Yeah, it's the second kind of, I suppose, interesting indictment that's come out of the Department of Justice in about 1 week. So the release from the Justice Department indicted 2 people, Dallas Humber, California, and someone called Matthew Allison of Idaho, and they alleged that they were the leaders of the so-called Telegram collective. They named it as a transnational terrorist group. I think people have had varying definitions of Telegram and how it functioned, but loosely, I suppose, it seemed to be a collection of Telegram accounts and channels, people behind them that advocated white supremacist violence and a kind of accelerationist ideology. And the 2 people indicted just today were indicted for soliciting hate crimes, soliciting the murder of federal officials, and conspiring to provide material to support terrorists. If you read through the indictment, it mentions a number of crimes internationally, not just in the United States, that were allegedly sort of incited or inspired by this collective and these 2 people.
Some of the charges seem very specific, things about inciting violence against a federal official specifically. I was wondering why that might be.
Yes, it does seem like the United States law enforcement, especially I guess on the federal level, do seem to be increasingly sensitive to threats against public officials. I mean, there has been reporting and they claim there has been an uptick in this kind of behaviour. And the indictment talks about something the Telegram collective kind of maintained called the list, quote unquote, which was a hit list of high value targets for assassination, included senators, United States District Court judge, state officials, some leaders of NGOs and things like that. But they also mentioned a scenario where an individual shot 3 people and killed 2 outside an LGBT bar in Slovakia, an individual who planned an attack on energy facilities in New Jersey, an individual who stabbed 5 people near a mosque in Turkey. So allegedly they were sort of incited Telegram users to commit attacks in furtherance of white supremacist accelerationism, according to the Department of Justice. It's interesting, and unfortunately, as these things always seem to reference our own Australian white supremacist terrorist, Brent, the Christchurch terrorist, he was named in a lot of this Telegram material as a so-called saint. So that's also mentioned in the indictment.
In regards to Telegram, I did find it somewhat remarkable that one of those who's been accused, Dallas Humber, was actually doxed about 18 months ago by some anti-fascist researchers in the United States. And yet so their identity was seemingly public some time ago. It's now 18 months later, this indictment has dropped. To Two questions. Why do you think, is there an explanation for that gap in time? And what does it say that it is apparently possible for anonymous anti-fascists in the United States or elsewhere to conduct research and investigation and publish it, which reveals some of these identities? This is not a job that's being performed necessarily elsewhere.
That's right. So Left Coast Right Watch, I think, was one of the organisations that published around Humber and sort of laid out the breadcrumbs of their identity, and that includes some other anti-fascist research groups, including here in Australia as well, I believe, participated in that. They also published with Huffington Post a sort of big breakdown of all the evidence that led them to name this woman. Yeah, it's very interesting that these collectives are able to dig into the footprint and unmask these people. And of course, the Department of Justice indictment doesn't reflect on that or provide any links between the two, but certainly Left Coast Right Watch got there first and the Department of Justice followed many months later. I suppose the distance between, or the length of time between the unmasking and the indictment, this is just wild speculation, but to build cases like this, I'm sure takes a long time. This is a 15-count indictment for soliciting hate crimes, soliciting the murder of federal officials, conspiring to provide material support to terrorists. So I'm sure there's a high bar there. I mean, this is a really interesting case, and it's a case we're seeing more of where people are not charged with directly sort of facilitating crimes like this, where they arm the person, where they financially fund it necessarily, but more that they provide kind of in the inciting ideology, encouragement and methodology.
Well, Ariel, I think we'll leave it there. I'm coming around to Albo's idea of just banning social media for everyone. Thanks so much for coming on. If people want to find you on x.com, you are at Ariel Bogle. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Well, Andy, that is our show. We'll be back next week.
See you then.
Все для оплаты по счетам. Грустно жить. Мне кажется, что много лет копейки лишней просто нет. Как мне быть? Есть мечта еще пока. Найти богатого мужичка, забыть работу навсегда и жить с размахом без труда. Такого днем с огнем, а я все думаю о нем. Грустно жить, и если вдруг его найду, навряд ли даже подойду. Как мне быть? Давно пора на самолет. Меня в Лас-Вегасе удача ждет. Я в Монте-Карло курс сорву и к новой жизни уплыву.
be stronger in denouncing what imperialism is doing to us and around the world.
Because the future belongs to all of us.
No social improvement, no victory is achieved without struggle.
And together, we will hold these fuckers accountable.
Disrupt land forces. 3CR continues to amplify frontline voices in a powerful stand against the global arms trade with a united call for peace. Tune in from the 8th to the 14th of September for our special coverage on the events with 8 a.m. updates and interviews on 3CR Breakfast, live from the front lines of resistance. You can listen back to our full coverage by visiting 3cr.org.au/DLF 2024. Disrupt Land Forces special coverage, 8th to the 14th of September on your radical community radio 3CR.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.